it's not as if there's some kind of test you can use to see whether this claim has been scientifically established or at least has the weight of scientific evidence on its side. Of course, this came out a lot with the whole pandemic. No one really knew what to think about masking, at least in some initial period. And that even when that kind of meta study came out quite recently from the place in the UK that everyone says is the gold standard for deciding these issues, it turns out even they are mostly analyzing some of these old studies that no one could extract any useful information out of. To what extent does that bear on masking during COVID? There are many different opinions. Are these studies giving us information or misinformation? That might not even be the right question to ask.
That was philosopher Michael Strevens and me, Natasha Mott, and on this episode of NeoAcademia, Michael and I discussed society's perception of science and his book, The Knowledge Machine. As a professor of philosophy at NYU, Michael keeps pretty busy working on complex systems, probabilities, causation, the philosophy of science, and science as a sociological system. This podcast is possible with thanks to the Theory Gang Substack subscribers, gang, and this season's sponsor, Big Nerve. I've been working with Big Nerve for a while now to develop a community of innovative, creative thinkers, and their goal is simple. They want to recognize and fund creative thinkers. They're trying to create an entire new profession of innovation where catalysts like me could ask interesting and engaging questions, and innovators like you can answer them. There are many different ways to play. You can ask questions, answer them, rate answers, mentor answers. All of this earns you points. At the end of the month, these idea tournaments pay out to the top 30 participants, and everybody gains some more experience points and gets known for their expertise. This game is meant to elevate creative thinkers and their ideas. To join my team, you'll have to click on the Big Nerve question in the Theory Gang newsletter, where each episode I'll design a special question relevant to the guest and discussion. All right, here's the episode. Now don't forget to listen all the way to the end for the question.
You know, the first time I saw you, it was in the National Academy's Committee on Misinformation. And I was streaming it on TikTok at the time. And I'm listening to you talk and you're smiling the whole time. And I started laughing hysterically because I'm looking at this committee. They're all so stern and they all seem very intent on gleaning some bit of useful information from what you're saying. And they're asking you, what is misinformation? And you're kind of like, I don't know. And I was like, I think I said on TikTok, I was like, who invited Michael Strevens to this party? They did the wrong thing. It seemed like they wanted you to say, this is misinformation and this is how we're going to get rid of it. Do you have this experience?
We had a little bit of back and forth about what I was going to do, so I don't think it was a total surprise. I said I would put the whole question into the historical context and talk about some of the challenges to distinguishing information from misinformation, which is then what I went on to do. I hope that was useful. In a way, one way to look at it is it's some reasons not to frame an inquiry into what is, I think, an important question around some kind of definition. Don't expect a definition that's going to be something you can refer back to and use as your foundation for thinking about this stuff. It's not that easy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that Cher, maybe that's who you're communicating with, he seemed to vibe with it. He was like, yeah, absolutely. And everybody else's face was just kind of like, this is not good. Because and I had just come off the heels of being at the Santa Fe Institute for the first time for their symposium on collective intelligence. And I heard the word misinformation kicked around a lot and had quite a lively debate with several people about what it is we should do about it. Because that was the main thing, is what should we do about it? And I'm kind of the camp of like, we have to let it ride a little bit. Would you say you're in that camp?
Yeah. I mean, there are, of course, there's the really crazy stuff. But so much of what really matters to people is so up in the air that it's hard to say what's the information and what's the misinformation. Or rather, ultimately we find out in the end, perhaps, what it was, but there's no kind of criterion. There's no it's not as if there's some kind of test you can use to see whether this claim has been scientifically established, or at least has the weight of scientific evidence on its side, versus something that's an interesting suggestion that maybe I shouldn't say that there's no distinctions that can be drawn, but there's a lot of argument about where the weight of evidence lies, or whether we have enough evidence to even decide one way or another. Of course, this came out a lot with the whole pandemic. For a while, I think no one really knew what to think about masking, at least in some initial period. And that really turned out, I think even when that kind of meta study came out quite recently from the place in the UK that everyone says is the gold standard for deciding these issues, it turns out even they are mostly analyzing some of these old studies that no one could extract any useful information out of, that had studies involving small numbers of people in different situations with different diseases and so on and so forth. To what extent does that bear on masking during COVID? There are many different opinions. So are these studies giving us information or misinformation? That might not even be the right question to ask.
Well, I think they only want to ask the question, they meaning like scientific authorities, so that they can use the information for policy, right? So this is where I think the problem lies, in trying to use science politically at its forefront. Like, I mean, if we're trying to use something established like gravity, I mean, there's a big difference from that to cutting edge science. Like, if we need to make policy based on, some like muons right now, maybe we shouldn't because we're not sure what's going on.
Yeah. Well, the thing about COVID is, of course, it is urgent to make some kind of policy. Not doing anything is itself a policy.
Right.
And in a situation like that, to start talking as though there's just somewhere out there is the science and we should follow the science is framing the whole problem in the wrong kind of way. I mean, that's not, of course, I'm a science fan. I'm a science believer. I think we should do the science, but it's not like there's just one flag being waved around and all you need to do is spot the science flag and head in that general direction. It's just much more complicated than that. And if citizens are going to make up their mind in an intelligent way about what to do in the face of a lot of uncertainty, I think they should have a better understanding of what we can and can't get out of science that's still very much in the making. So yes, with something like the question of whether or not the Earth is flat, we have a consensus. But with so many other questions, what you have is a situation where it's not just that we have uncertainty, we have disagreement about which are the more important or revealing sources of evidence. Should we think more about the controlled experiments that were done with masking? Is that the more important thing? Or is it more important to think about the actual mechanism underlying COVID transmission and think about sort of exactly what masks keep in and keep out and so on? And that a lot of that stuff was flying back and forth. And I think there was no way early on, and it's still difficult to say exactly what we should believe. I mean, I'm pretty middle of the road on these things. I'm not pushing for any kind of extreme position, but I do think there's a lot of uncertainty. It's very hard to just brand something in particular as misinformation when it's a claim that's being made in the middle of this kind of ferment.
Exactly. I mean, where I detached from science during the pandemic was in the moment I realized the gaping hole in our understanding is philosophical, not scientific. So let's say, we understand the R naught of any particular pathogen. We understand, how lethal it is. We understand all of these things. The question that remains is still what should be done about it. And that's a philosophical, moral question to say, if it's going to kill 10% of the population, 5%, 3.5, how the choices you make in your personal life, how does that relate to that? This is the philosophical question. And I started to realize that people who I consider, they're scientists, not that I considered them, they're working scientists. They were using these heuristics and completely neglecting the philosophical aspect. So I did like a little thought experiment on Facebook, right? I left Facebook right after this because I was so pissed. But I said, imagine you have 100 people in a room and you can get 50 out. They're all ages, total mixed population. Who would you get out first? And a couple of my scientist friends said, well, the children. And I thought, like, if you're using scientific reasoning, that is not the answer. We understand that the morbidity is very low in children. You failed. You're not a scientist. This is bullshit. I was pissed and I called them out on it. And they were like, and they had nowhere to go. They were backed into a corner and they realized that they were not thinking scientifically and that maybe there's something that they're missing, but they doubled down on it. I think that's the moment when I broke from being a scientist and like started more into philosophy. But do you think, well, first of all,
Well,
were you,
yeah, and I half agree with you and say that there's not really such a thing even as thinking scientifically about this. So we shouldn't really expect scientists to come up with better answers than anyone else. I mean, of course, they should remember how much more dangerous COVID is in older people than younger people. So it would be a mistake to forget that. But after that, this kind of deliberation just lies completely outside the scope of scientific inquiry, I think. In fact, I think in a way this is going to be a little bit extreme, but there's no such thing as scientific thinking, even about science.
right?
There's what scientists are doing is no different from what anyone else would be doing. What's really characteristic of science is a kind of evidence gathering procedure that is designed not to require any kind of interpretation of the evidence, kind of thing I was just talking about. So not to require any kind of thinking as such. I mean, you have to think about what to do in order to, a scientist has to think to themselves what the best thing to do is, but that thinking that they're doing privately about the kind of research they're going to do is no different from ordinary people's thinking, I think. There's not a scientific way to do that kind of thinking. Insofar as, you can think about the kind of question you posed more scientifically or less scientifically, it's just that can't mean a whole lot more than bringing in whatever scientific knowledge you have. But then as soon as the deliberation begins, I think scientists are just people too.
That is such a controversial thing to say, but I agree with you so firmly. And it should not be a controversial thing to say. But I think the problem is most people don't understand science. I mean, not even the scientists doing science. People are, I do these TikTok lives and I put this kind of question above my head, what is science? And people come in and they have these answers. They're like, it's X, it's Y, it's Z, it's all
Right.
these things. What's a theory? I know what a theory. And I'm like, cool, but no. Like, we don't know. And you're absolutely right. Like, it's about the experiment. So I think this is a great time to talk about what's going on Twitter right now
Yeah.
and the whole integrated information theory. Is it representative of consciousness? Could there even be a science of consciousness? And I think I know your perspective. Maybe I could guess at it,
Okay.
but I'd love to hear you tell it.
Sure. Well, there's a sense in which what I just said, although it may sound a little bit unhinged about there not really being a scientific thinking, a kind of set of rules that's characteristic of the way scientists think about, really any kind of question. The flip side of that sounds incredibly straightforward and uncontroversial, which is that science is all about empirical testing. So I do think that the mark of scientific inquiry is to formulate theories and test them. And so if something like integrated information theory is going to be amenable to scientific inquiry, and, if it's not, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, I should add. I'm a philosopher. A lot of what I do is not amenable to scientific inquiry, but I still think I'm doing a good thing. But if it's going to be science, then the bottom line is, and again, I'll say this is a very conventional view, empirical testing. Can we test this theory? Are there ways to pile up evidence in favor of it or against it? And I know quite a bit of this argument has been around whether it really is testable or not.
Right. Yeah. Well, that is the question, and then one of the big questions is computational modeling an adequate empirical test? Because a lot of what, and on complexity, a lot of what's happening there is mathematical fitting, perhaps overfitting of models. And that can never be truly representative of reality, but is it close enough? And what do we do with this asymptotic entity that we might have on our hands? It's like almost
Mhm.
science. It's like Fire Robert says, like the science is it like the science light? I mean, where does computation fit into this?
Well, I think a lot of real scientific inquiry involves a lot of computation and computational modeling, but it's always with an eye to the empirical testing. So these models perform many intermediate functions, but the goal finally is to create some kind of set of theories or models or something like that that make predictions about what you'll see in various experiments, at least in the experimental sciences, or what you'll observe in the more observational sciences like astronomy, cosmology. And what really distinguishes a kind of ordinary standard sciencey modeling from the kind of, I think actually really, really interesting, but I still think of as not exactly science modeling as speculation that goes on. Maybe it could be in theories of consciousness, or it just could be the kind of thing that the Santa Fe Institute was famous for, that is exploring the consequences of various mathematical principles. What really distinguishes them is whether the ultimate point is to bring experimental data or observational data ultimately on some idea to test it, or whether it's something else. So there's a kind of a pursuit which take something like artificial life that was once a big thing at Santa Fe, and everybody enjoys messing around with the game of life or some system like that. There's a kind of open-ended, joyful, really kind of fascinating, no doubt philosophical enterprise which consists in just building those artificial life models and seeing what they do, and then maybe even kind of generalizing about what they do. But I think that a lot of that enterprise wasn't really concerned with ultimately formulating some claims about what would be observed in the real world or even in the computer world. It was a kind of creative intellectual pursuit that was just in the end not about empirical testing.
Engineering, you might say, even.
Yeah. I suppose there's lots of applications it might have ultimately had, but I think people loved it partly just for the sheer intellectual joy of building these things, which I can totally empathize with. In the case of something like consciousness, the intellectual joy is, of course, of framing ideas about how consciousness might possibly emerge. And I think, again, that's a intellectually valuable enterprise, but I wouldn't count it as a scientific enterprise unless there's some game plan for ultimately wrenching predictions out of these models and putting them to the test.
Right. Previous guests I've had just a couple episodes ago was Eric Hull, and he said, he thinks that neuroscience specifically, not the neural correlates of consciousness side of it, but the consciousness itself is a pre-paradigmatic science. And part of me thinks perhaps, but part of me thinks, how many pursuits did we think were going to be a science and then never turned out to be one? Why does everything have to eventually become a science? I mean, what is this? Why do we want this?
No, I think, and a really important thing to emphasize here is that to say something isn't a science, or this isn't, strictly speaking, scientific inquiry, is not necessarily to criticize it. Now, I know, and with things like IIT and so on, often the labeling it as not scientific is thought of as a criticism, and it often is intended as a criticism. If it's not scientific, then it's just idle speculation. It's kind of a waste of effort and grant money, insofar as there is grant money. But I don't think of it that way at all. I think we can say this is right. If this is science, it's pre-paradigmatic, or as you say, maybe it's just not going in that direction at all, but that doesn't make it a bad thing. It doesn't make it a useless thing. It doesn't even make it, it could be something that will be very useful one day for a more empirical form of inquiry. Some of these ideas about complexity, for example, may one day be a part of a program of scientific inquiry. And
right.
So we shouldn't dismiss it because it's not science. It's important to kind of understand that the one aspect of science as being such a kind of a narrow thing. I mean, I think a narrow thing that's incredibly successful because of its narrowness is there's going to be a lot of stuff that falls outside those limits that is still valuable.
Even the metaphor of the knowledge machine, there's a lot of, I don't even know if I'd call it byproducts, but the way I imagine the knowledge machine or the metaphor of it, like, a lot of stuff goes in and it refines the stuff through the process of science. And then something very specific comes out, and the byproducts, they're still there. But for example, just been reading about like fish and the eye and the, like, the I, the self. That's still part of the consciousness that has yet to become a science, and it may never become a science. But it was nevertheless a really interesting and useful piece that, think about how much utility we've gotten coming from like the bicameral mind to now cognitive behavioral therapy, where we can kind of control a lot of our own destinies, and that was an intermediate step along the way. Although, I mean, I feel like I say we, and I mean my former self as well, looking down on things like, being trained as a scientist saying, that's not a science. That's, what is this perspective? Why do we have this? Is it moral?
Are you asking why do we have this a perspective that's sort of focused on science as the single source of, I don't know, epistemic value?
Yes.
The one true way of knowing? I mean, science has been so successful that it's almost inevitable that it will start to get a little bit dictatorial or authoritarian in its pretensions, I think. I'm not saying that about individual scientists, but just about the place in the intellectual culture of the modern world. It's so much has been achieved through science, and so many lives have been saved. Not always science at its most kind of conceptual level. A lot of it is kind of very simple empirical work on what works and doesn't work, medically speaking, for example. But it's been so successful, it can be hard to remember sometimes that it's worth doing anything else.
That's a good answer. I mean, and I also wonder if, we haven't built our entire society around science and technology in a way that is kind of cut our nose off to spite our face. Like we could disappear into it. Do you think there's a way to kind of, I don't want to say slow the progress of it, but everyone talks about how impeding the progress of science might be a bad thing. Do you think maybe that there might be a case for impeding the progress of science?
Well, I think part of the narrowness of science actually means that the day-to-day reality of science is that people may believe that it's this great intellectually imperialist project that's threatening to just swamp all the rest of culture. But I think by its very nature, it's totally incapable of actually doing that. There's a kind of a rhetoric of doing things scientifically, thinking through problems scientifically and so on. But there's no actual reality behind that rhetoric. Science will only ever be this again, I'll say incredibly successful, but still quite constrained way of going about trying to answer certain kinds of questions. There'll never be something that can literally and properly be called a scientific politics or a scientific morality. People may make that claim for their politics and their morality as a ploy, to beat down their opponents, but it's not, such a thing is not, it's just couldn't possibly exist. Science just isn't the kind of thing that even could direct political thinking or moral thinking or many other kinds of thinking. Even the kind of integrative thinking that just tries to make sense of the scientific worldview's connection to everything else, or I should say the picture we get of the world from science, from our physics and biology and so on, the way that I suppose philosophers in particular, but philosophers in the broader sense, try to connect that to all of the other ways of how we have of thinking about the world. That's a very important pursuit. And you can take science into account, take scientific knowledge into account, give it its due weight, but there's not a scientific way to build that bigger picture. So science just doesn't have the capacity to be this all-purpose, totally domineering system.
I agree. I agree with you, but my fear is not that it will be. My fear is that it will be utilized as such. Like the novel I referenced last time, We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Have you read this? Like it's a
Oh,
precursor to Orwell, really. Orwell was
yeah,
inspired by
no, I
Huxley.
haven't, but I know what you're talking about.
It's, technocratic dystopia, and it's based on, trying to build a completely scientifically rational
Mhm.
world. And I worry that we will try to get there. And I think the reason why I think we could get there is because of the deception that we relay to the public. I think there's a pretense that science is certain, and we try to relay that to the public, and the public sees right through it, unfortunately. And I mean, I worry that if too many people, are ignorant of it. And it's funny because the people that are the most ignorant are kind of people who are in the like, I fucking love science group, these people who are like, they don't realize they're pretty much practicing scientism. It's very odd to me that the people who probably know the least about it are the most skeptical, and properly so. But then the people close to it are almost sycophantic about it. Do you worry about this at all?
Well, I do worry. I do worry more about that, the way that, so the picture of science we're talking about is the picture I was repudiating earlier on when we were talking, that there's a scientific way of thinking and a scientific form of deliberation. And that, if that were true, then in some sense, there would be something you could take to apply to all of these other kinds of problems. And this, the image of the scientific way of doing things is it's very kind of logical and objective. It prescribes certain moves and so on, which on the one hand is very helpful because it means you get a lot of agreement. It means that you get a lot of help in kind of making your decisions. But on the other hand, it looks very dangerous because it excludes so much. So much is just kind of off the table. That in this image of what scientific thinking is like, I think that picture of science can be dangerous both to the people you're worrying about right now, the people who kind of advocate the scientific worldview, and who I think tend to mistake their own thinking for the paradigm of scientific thinking. Well, they look around, they say, well, I like science, or maybe I'm a scientist, so my way of thinking about politics must be that scientific way of thinking about politics that I believe in. And you can kind of start to get a sense of where that may lead. But equally, this same picture, I think, is potentially very dangerous for people who don't know very much about science, because they expect science to have a certain character. They expect science to be the kind of machine that can take whatever we know about, going back to COVID, take whatever we know about the coronavirus and so on, and come out with a set of recommendations, not with certainty or anything like that. It might come out just by saying, okay, here's what we know so far. Probably this is good. Probably this isn't good. And we're waiting for more information to say more. But the thing is, you do get a kind of here's what science knows at this particular time. Maybe not that much yet. Maybe we wish it knew more, but we have a kind of a picture. We've thought scientifically about the evidence, and here's the right thing to do now. That's what people are expecting from science. And what they get instead is all of these scientists yelling at one another, or certainly disagreeing with one another, giving very different stories about which kind of data is worth taking seriously and which isn't. And it looks like this whole thing about science is just propaganda. It's the story that's being used to kind of foist a certain view on, poor old you. But there's no real objectivity there. It's just open season, and whoever has the most institutional power can use the rhetorical power of the word scientific to do whatever is most convenient for them. And that view then leads to a kind of science skepticism and a refusal to take seriously what we can kind of glean from the data at any given point that we see springing up all over the place with respect to a whole bunch of different questions. So the pandemic, of course, climate change, of course, and a whole lot of other things as well. So that people expect from science much more than is really there. When they don't get it, they think the whole operation is bankrupt. Actually, it's not bankrupt. It really is this wonderful, precious way we have of finding things out. But because it looks so different from the way people expect it to look, they don't recognize it when it is working the way it's supposed to be working. they see those disagreements about how to interpret the data as a pathology rather than as science just running its usual course.
The science skeptics, I'm very interested in them in particular. Like, for some reason, people tend to come to me with their flat earth theories and their anti-vax and their whatever, because because I'm a scientist and I don't, or I was a scientist. There's a question as to whether that identity exists. But I don't kind of make them feel stupid. And in the book, we were talking about how the knowledge machine produces all these different voices and all this dispute, and we need translators towards the end of the book. You mentioned like the IPCC would be a translator. And I see issue with this because it doesn't represent the common person in any way. And so you're going to be speaking the language of those who are scientifically inclined and interested, but you're still not speaking the language of those who are skeptical. And I think what happens with those who are skeptical is they're told things like, this is 100% safe, or this is absolutely, anthropocentric. And then they find little things and they cling to those little things and they go, you're lying. And so how do we deal with the translating body, which I don't know if I agree that that should be the translating body. That is merely an arbitrating body. It arbitrates the disputes, but then we still need a translating body.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, translator is not the right way to characterize what's going on, because it's not just a matter of taking a bunch of esoteric knowledge and putting it into a form that's easier to understand.
Right.
The word arbitrate is exactly right. What you're doing is you're taking a bunch of data that has a lot of inconsistencies and problems and also a huge amount of information, and trying to get out of it, extract from it some sort of reasonable summary, which is it's not in any way dictated by the body of evidence itself. But to say something like, the closest you can get is the kind of formulations they use in law courts, what a reasonable person would think if they read all these papers, except of course that reasonable person would have to be an expert in about 500 different things, so they don't really exist. Right. But find a kind of a middle ground, which is a compromise. It's the kind of thing that an arbitrator would find, not the truth, but just something that's somewhere in the middle that doesn't,
right.
It's not extreme. And then that's kind of the best we can do when we're in the middle of science. And there's still a lot of controversy about, there's a lot of consensus too, but there's also a lot of controversy about very important questions and which data to take more seriously, which to give more weight to, and so on. There's no real answer to the question, who is going to do the right job here. You have to do a job that is at the same time is partly political, partly sociological. I think you are trying to do justice to the way that everyone thinks. But inevitably, the people who are doing this work are experts who come from the fields in question, who are not representative of the world at large. And you really have to hope that the process of coming together to make this decision in a context that they themselves realize is not in strictly speaking a scientific context. You have to hope that the weight of that responsibility pushes them to seek out the kinds of institutional biases, the collective agreement on things that might not be as well established as on closer examination. And there's a little bit of intellectual honesty, and still what you get out is going to be in a sense a kind of an opinion, but it's going to be a middle ground, middle of the road opinion, which hopefully doesn't neglect some very important possibilities. So it's a very, very difficult job to do. Even with the best will in the world, it's not going to be done brilliantly, because that's, I think, close to logically impossible. The best you can hope for is as with politicians themselves formulating public policy, or the people in government more generally formulating policy, that they try to be as open-minded and as open to the concerns of all the legitimate human concerns as possible.
Yeah. The way I'm thinking about it is most people can't relate to this training mechanism that they put scientists through. Like we talked about previously about, when I was trained as a scientist, it was kind of like, okay, you need to not do this, not do that. You need to focus on this, only do these studies and don't think too far outside of anything. Barely be human was the was the
Yeah,
request.
right.
And then these people, I think they're, like you said, they're trained as almost a militia, like an informational militia.
Mm-hmm.
And then people are expected to understand the direction of the militia. Like, why is our scientific military marching on whatever it's marching on? And people don't feel represented. Whereas, like the actual militia, if you think about who feels represented in that population, interestingly, it may be quite the opposite, that the people that are most represented in the actual military are people who are farther removed from science. So the scientists and, more intellectuals may understand that movement less. But I guess I'm asking, how do we balance it? How do we communicate with people who are so far removed from science that they don't have a clue what's going on and don't trust the institution? Eric Howell just said in his latest blog, something like hiding the dirty laundry or something, like don't air our dirty laundry, I felt like was a very telling phrase. Or do we just tell it like it is? We don't really know. We're doing the best we can.
I'm very pro dirty laundry. That's
You're
kind of
pro putting it out
what I
there.
was saying earlier. I think in the end, it will really help for ordinary people to have an accurate view of science. There is a lot of disagreement. Of course, you can see the immediate dangers of this because it can look like it's playing into the hands of skeptics, or people who are using skepticism for other reasons. But I think in the end, it's what we should do. There's always a lot of disagreement about this stuff. Science typically gets there in the end, but sometimes that's too late because we need to do something right now. So what we need to do is take this disagreement in the same way we take disagreement in politics and put it together, not into the sort of the one logically correct thing to think, but just some sort of middle ground proposal that is maybe what no one really believes, but that kind of captures as much of that information as we can, given that we don't really know which is the good information and which is the bad information.
Yeah.
I mean, I exaggerate a little bit, of course. There's many signs that we can use to think, well, that's probably better information and that's probably worse. But there's nothing like enough consensus on that, even among the experts, to say, oh, there's just a consensus on on what we should say about climate change right now. There isn't. What there is the result of a negotiation by many different people, and then a process that tries, as I say, to find a kind of middle ground that doesn't necessarily represent anyone's particular view, but which is a reasonable set of guesses, not too influenced by any one set of biases. And people have to know that's all that we're really getting from the IPC. It's the best we can get, but it's a lot better than the alternative.
Right, which is nothing, which is
Exactly.
a complete mysticism. Yeah, because I think anytime we marry politics with science too much, it runs the risk of losing its value entirely. It's a very fine, narrow path to travel. And thinking of the climate situation right now, where you've got what politically the right in the United States calls like climate alarmism. And then the left is like, it's extinction. I mean, I think is the word they're using, which like, it's got to be somewhere in the middle. And here's the thing too, is couldn't we speak to real situations? Like, for example, rising sea levels. If this were to happen, regardless of whether it's human caused or nature, it just happens in nature. What are we going to do about it? Isn't there a way to talk about this without it being so heavily politicized? Because these are real things that are happening. I mean, in Florida, in all these coastal areas, it's not a surprise that Miami floods every year. Like, we know. So why do we have to frame everything with this political impetus?
What makes it hard, though, especially for someone like me who thinks, yeah, let's tell it like it is, this is the way science really works, is that scientists' political views do creep into the way they interpret the data. They dictate the way they interpret the data, but it does creep in. It does have an effect. And I guess if you're going to tell it like it is, you have to admit that and say, here's kind of what we're doing about it.
Right.
And we're doing the best we can. Well, we're probably not doing the best we can, of course. But the realistic alternatives are even worse.
We're not doing the best we can because we know, but not everybody agrees with you that we should be telling it like it is.
Well,
So
okay.
the point
Well,
to tell.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But we're, at least this is my way of thinking about it. Something like the IPCC view is going to be wrong in lots of ways, and they incorporate uncertainty in their views and they say this is 75% probable, but some of that's just going to turn out to be quite wrong, and maybe even wrong because of certain systematic biases, which maybe come as much from institutional things that only the scientists themselves would really even appreciate. The way that if you work in someone's graduate program or work in someone's lab, you tend to be much more familiar with, and you tend to trust the methods that are used there, and you're a little bit less trusting of methods that are used elsewhere. It's kind of political, even though it's got nothing to do with left and right. But all of that stuff is going on all the time. Anyway, because it is going on, if you're going to give people an accurate picture of science, you somehow have to reassure them that it's not just a total disaster, that the alternatives are all actually much worse, even as you admit that this story you're getting from, say, the IPCC, and I don't mean to demean them in any way at all, but the story you're getting is kind of a mix of the subjective and the objective, despite all the best efforts of the people who have contributed to those reports. You got to admit that that's the way it is, and somehow get people to see that, just as with a political compromise, though it's can no doubt in retrospect we'll be able to criticize it in many different ways, some of which we can't even conceive of right now. There'll be mistakes that nobody's even thought that we might be making, that it turns out we've been making. In spite of all of that, doing it this way is better than doing it any other way.
Right. Look at your face while you're saying this. I feel like I can see the anguish because I mean, I think your perspective is still a minority perspective amongst scientists and me. I mean, I don't know. What do you even think, like philosophers of science, modern philosophers of science? Do you think you're still a minority perspective?
I think a lot of philosophers of science would agree with some of the basic premises here, that there's not sort of there's no way a committee like the IPCC can really claim to have just simply come up with the objective content of the data.
Well, but this is the issue, right? Is, like you said in the book, Dawkins and I forget who else, Krauss basically said what you do is a waste of your life. Like they were like, philosophers of science, you should just go kick rocks because you're not important and what you say is not important and it's the scientists that are important. Why is it this versus situation? I mean, do you feel like, have you been personally attacked ever, or like, what is the...
No, not really. Even as I say in the book, I think even some of those people have had acrimonious debates with individual philosophers, but over much more personal things. Like Krauss had a pretty angry exchange with actually my old teacher, David Albert, over David's quite negative review of his book. And, that's the sort of thing people, of course, do argue acrimoniously about.
Right.
They take it personally, and understandably so. But I don't actually take some of those bigger claims about the uselessness of philosophy actually as particularly hostile to philosophy, even though on the surface that's exactly what they are. I see them more as kind of rallying cries to the scientists saying, look, when you're doing science, don't worry about this philosophy stuff. It's not important to what you're doing. And actually, I think that's good advice to scientists. It's not good advice to human beings kind of trying to think about the world as a whole, but it is the right thing to be thinking as you're in the lab trying to produce a useful bucket full of data.
Yes. And I mean, I didn't know I would be more inclined to philosophy. I had no clue. I actually thought, I didn't know I was, I'm first generation in my family to go to college. And so they were like, you smart, be a doctor. And then I was like, oh, I could be a scientist because being a doctor sounds like it sucks. So, but that whole, put your nose to the grindstone, don't worry about all this other stuff. Really, I think I didn't read philosophy, not one iota, never took philosophy 101 until I left science and I looked around. I was like, this does not answer questions I have. And so it wasn't until much later that I had any philosophical inclinations. And so I think the way I see it is it's a real detriment to like modern polymathy. If we are to see any emergence of modern polymathy, it would have to be well, I don't know if it would have to be, but we would need people to start looking into science and then be distracted and look elsewhere. That's like where all the brightest minds go now is science, computation, mathematics. Like, don't we want a fraction of those people looking around at the world?
Totally, totally. And, the science of almost anything can get very complicated. So it's hard to use it in a productive, fruitful way to answer these bigger questions without being a bit of an expert in it, or certainly having spent some time becoming acquainted with it. And so naturally you go to scientists themselves to answer these questions. And some scientists, when they're in the lab, they're doing their science, they have their lab coats on, they think one way. And then when they turn around and address the world, they really can. All the shackles fall away and they can think like a human being. They do think like a human being. Well, as I said earlier, I guess all scientists think like human beings, but they can, they think like a philosopher who wants to sort of see how everything hangs together. But the problem you raise is a real one, because on the one hand, it seems like you need a bunch of experts to understand this stuff in the first place. But then the job description for the experts and the way the best science gets done is to ignore all these bigger questions. This is what I think Dawkins and Krauss and Stephen Hawking and so on all about. Don't think philosophically if you're going to be a good scientist. So it's a very small number of people who are able to kind of have that basically dual nature where they can really thrive in the lab and enjoy being there, rather than just feeling locked down. And also think in a fruitful way outside the lab. The alternative, there are those people. And then there are people like some philosophers who are, because they have the comfort of a university position, in effect, you're being paid to spend about half your time thinking. You kind of do have the time to go and get really acquainted with some of the sciences. And so, coming from the others, instead of the scientist becoming a part-time philosopher, the philosopher becomes a part-time scientist.
Yeah.
That's the other way to find the polymaths that you want. But, it's a tall order to be that kind of person. It's not straightforward to create the situation where it's even possible to live that life.
It's definitely a weirdo, but I mean, I guess the way I think about it is you could have a category of people that go very surface level on a lot of things, or
Right.
you have ones that take a big scoop out of like a few different things. And
Right.
and that's kind of like where those things converge in the book. I loved your little story about if you knocked on the door of Newton's laboratory in Cambridge, you would find him in his alchemy robes. And you had to piss people off with this, right? Like, I mean, who people have to be mad at you about this. Like, you're painting Newton as like a part-time alchemist. I
Well,
mean,
he was a part-time
well, I
alchemist.
know he was,
I mean,
but
we knew that.
you're spilling the tea on this.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, how dare you? But I think this is at the root of the political divide. There's like this Machiavellian nature to what we do in the lab that like you wouldn't understand it. It's too complex. I just finished yesterday Against Method. Like I said, I was reading it on TikTok and I thought several times in reading the book, oh shit, I should not be doing this. People come into this live and they hear me saying like anything goes in science. And they're like, I knew it. I understand the fear and trepidation that kind of causes the Machiavellian nature, but why do you think we're in this situation? What do you and where do you think most of this is coming from?
Wait, what situation?
Like what I'm saying about the Machiavellian nature of science, like thinking about, oh, we can't tell people the truth about science.
Oh, I see. Hmm. Well, I mean, I suppose the reasoning there is that science's authority rests in large part on this somewhat false picture of the way it actually works.
Right.
Like the scientist is like the professor. You go to, well, the teacher, you go to the classroom and they have knowledge and they impart their knowledge to you.
Mm-hmm.
People want that. People like that picture of science, and that science can really use it to its advantage to justify its place in the universe.
That's power. is really what we're talking about, is like wielding institutional power.
Well, yeah, I mean, it might not be in a sinister way. It could just be the science. I really believe the science is valuable, but it's also expensive. We need to persuade people to pay for it. So we
Yeah.
want to paint it in a light, make science seem like some wise, benevolent old man with a long beard who's dispensing truth in the calmest and most authoritative way.
Yeah. Put a
And
coin in and get it. What is it? What is the great Zoltar or whatever? The game you can put a coin in and get a fortune or whatever.
oh, right, yes, right, kind of, yeah. Except you put $1 billion in.
$1 billion and get a scientific truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of picture people have already. It's kind of tempting to run with it and then to use it.
Well, I think what happens, what do they say about like the truth? It's like at first they ridicule you for it and then they copy it or whatever. I mean, maybe it's the case that the vast majority of scientists in this kind of like reductive mentality have not recognized this truth about science yet because, as you say, they're busy face down in their petri dishes or whatever.
They don't need to think about these things.
And what if they do? What if all of a sudden all of them wake up tomorrow and go, oh gosh, they suddenly are granted like all the knowledge of Kuhn and everyone to science if that happens.
They shouldn't have. I was a bit quick saying that they don't need to know this stuff. In a way, they already do know this stuff, but they haven't integrated their knowledge into their picture of science, I think. So I'm just talking about some typical scientist who, on the one hand, has a picture of science that might not actually be so different from the wise old man or the vending machine sage. That kind of comes from, that's kind of a personification of their textbooks, which are just, here's what we know. But in their everyday lives, they run into all of these difficulties interpreting data all the time. They're constantly, at least politely, disagreeing with one another, and sometimes not so politely behind the scenes. They say, you would know this very well. They say, oh, so-and-so's lab, I don't really trust anything coming out of that lab.
Sure thing, yeah.
Which would be really shocking, I think, if people at large could have heard that kind of banter, that it's constant. Or, but this lab, actually, I really do trust. And these results I'm really suspicious of. My results, of course, I trust a lot. So, and part of being in science is negotiating all of these thoughts. You can't write any of this stuff down, and when you write a paper, you can't say that sort of thing. You can't say.
Oh, that's why they didn't like my paper.
Yeah.
That's why my notebook was so messed up. Like, you should see my lab notebook. It was awful. I did it entirely wrong.
Well, you can write it, I guess, in your not your lab notebook, perhaps, but somewhere. Just
like, I think I wrote, oh shit, I fucked this up, or like, this is terrible, or this is wrong, I don't trust this. I wasn't probably supposed to write it there. Definitely, I was criticized for having too flowery of language in my manuscripts. So when you wrote this in that book, about like what is broadcast up on the slide, what is published in the scientific record versus what is said in hushed lab meetings, or, people don't know this. They really don't.
Right. So the scientists, of course, do know this. They know what happens in lab meetings. They know how important these kinds of deliberations are. So suppose they think the work coming out of that lab is not so great, then it's probably not worth your while to try to use it, to replicate it, to build research on top of it, right? So it really these kind of opinions really make it are strategically really important to your scientific career, even though you never breathe a word of it in your scientific publications. So of course scientists know this. But I think for many of them, they haven't quite,
right.
And it's not their job to do this, but they sort of haven't quite sort of squared that with the other side of science, which I think is very real too, which all scientists know, which is that in the end, we have a lot of well-established knowledge, a lot of knowledge of the way the world works that's based on very powerful, convincing sets of evidence. And somehow these two worlds coexist, and the kind of that in the moment short-term world is in fact the engine that kind of drives us down the road in this long-term direction. And that almost paradox is in a way what I'm trying to explain and make sense of in my book.
The scientist is kind of schizo. They have to,
Mm.
or
Yeah.
they are very good at compartmentalizing, because this is exactly what I said about the thought experiment I did, where I said, who would you take out of the room if 50 people were to get COVID? And I think when you push them to that limit and make them recognize that they're not entirely scientific, they close in on that gap. I think they start to sputter, and they've reached that moment of aporia where they're backed into a corner, which I suspect people will start to wake up to this, because I did. I started to think, how do I apply science to my life? I really did start to think this. And when I realized I couldn't successfully, I started to short circuit, I think. But the other metaphor you wrote in the book was about science being like a coral reef. And immediately, well, I do this with anybody, no matter what they write, I go, no. So don't take it personal. But I thought, well, because my husband and I both enjoy invertebrates and we've cultured these for a while, I was like, you're talking about stony corals, right? The calcium carbonate excreting, lime excreting corals. But not all corals are hard corals. And you said that the analogy or the metaphor was science is like a coral reef. And I started thinking, no, not all of them are like this. And what I really got at was, I think epistemology is like the coral reef. And science is maybe part of that bony exoskeleton, those hard corals in particular. But without any critical component of this, the fish, the microbes, the algae, the whole thing falls apart. So, I mean, at the end, you kind of said, oh, science it's not a coral reef. It's not this and that. So I assumed you would agree with it, but I kept waiting for it in the book. I was like, is he going to come back to this metaphor? Because I feel like he set us up to say, no, it's not like that. But would you agree like that? I mean, you're not an epistemological relativist. Let's get that clear. You're not a total subjectivist, right?
Right. Right.
But what else leaves a hard exoskeleton like science, if anything? I mean, history. And then what do you think about the study of history as a science, like Peter Turchin? How do you feel about the cleodynamics situation?
Well,
Sorry. Put you on the spot.
it's interesting. I mean, I think I kind of love that sort of stuff just by intellectual affinity. With
Yeah.
regard, that doesn't mean I think it's has much chance of being true.
Mm-hmm.
But I do, I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit torn, actually. On the one hand, it seems to not have, it's, the real world is so much more complicated than the stuff that makes it into the equations. You think these equations cannot possibly be incorporating everything that makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Although it's, on the other hand, actually, this is one of my big research interests. So this goes beyond just liking the sound of it. It's amazing the degree to which you can succeed in writing down pretty simple equations for some kinds of systems that do leave out a lot of stuff that looks like it ought to be relevant. And it turns out not to be so relevant. So I think the project is not crazy, but it is, what's the right word for it? Bold.
Yeah. Okay. I like bold.
Yeah.
I guess in complexity, Eric was saying this is called mechanistic interpretability, which is also in like AI, where you're, like you said, how can certain variables be included and probably like on a fat-tailed curve, a huge number of them are like not included, but the equation still works and describes and fits reality. And this boils down to like that. I don't know why I called it plausible parsability and he called it mechanistic interpretability. But the idea of like, how much does any one system or variable contribute to the description of something? So this is something you're interested in. And how do you do research as a philosopher on this?
Well, not empirically. I try to understand, in this particular kind of work, what kind of structure in the real world makes it the case that so much stuff that looks like it ought to be relevant is not. So you could, that in a way, one of the main elements of this kind of inquiry is mathematics. Mm-hmm. So trying to write down admittedly in a sort of somewhat loose way, mathematical properties of the low-level dynamics, let's say something like an ecosystem, which make it the case that things like, the position of let's say it's just Canadian lynxes hunting snowshoe hares. You can write down equations that have some success in describing how the population changes over time without having to take into account the positions of every single animal. Yeah, what is it that determines population change? It's individual births and deaths. What determines, say, in particular, individual deaths? Well, for the hares, often just accidentally being too close to a lynx. So things like the individual positions are really important to the way the population changes. Yet, even intuitively, I think we think, I can kind of ignore those. I can kind of think of it as just kind of like rolling the dice or drawing balls out of a big urn full of balls or something like that, because there's something about the way these systems work that creates a certain randomness to this. And in virtue of what we call the law of large numbers, that randomness, the individual events don't matter so much. You're going to get very likely certain definite patterns out, whatever happens. So it doesn't really matter exactly what happens in each time I toss a coin, I'm going to get about 50% heads and about 50% tails. So if I only care about those statistics, if I only care about population numbers, I don't have to model all the individual causal goings on. But it's not obvious why lynxes chasing hares should be like tossing a coin. So it's kind of finding the structural, which really means the mathematical similarities between coin tossing and the Canadian boreal forest is the thing I've tried to do in my work on this. Obviously, completely different from what I'm up to in the knowledge machine.
Right. Yeah, no, but I mean, that's what's cool about it. To be honest, I'm like totally ignorant. Like I said, I never really even met a philosopher in college. I totally avoided the philosophy department because, I was going to graduate in 3 years and get my PhD and do science. And, I was that kind of ding dong. And I loved being on campus. So like, I really should have wandered a lot more because what you're talking about, I'm just now discovering. Coming at it from a scientific perspective, it's very difficult because I'm looking at it going, is this wrong? Is this bad? Whereas, you're coming from a computational perspective. Is that right?
Oh, well, originally, yes, computer science and mathematics, which I use in some of my philosophy, like the work I was just describing about complex systems. And I don't really use at all in the work when I'm thinking about science itself. Well, I guess I use it in a way just to help me understand what's going on in particular sciences. But if something like the knowledge machine is more like a work of sociology or sociological epistemology or something like that.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting to me that you kind of can do both. So what would you say about this idea that a large chunk of human knowledge is now fully democratized and not exclusive to the university? And what's exclusive to the university is extremely esoteric. What do we do with that now? Is there some room for this like neo-academic principle, or what are your thoughts when I said that to you? I'm just kind of wondering if you might spitball on that.
So here are two ways forward. I mean, I share your sense that there's a danger in modern life that there is not enough of this kind of synthesizing or syncretic thinking, or at least it's very. And even if there are enough people doing it, it's very hard for them to find places where they can actually present their ideas where anyone will pay attention to them. Of course, maybe that's true for pretty much any idea these days. And so here are two different ways of thinking about what you might do about it. One is to think, well, at least as far as the way the university is organized, basically the way we have things right now actually works pretty well. Of course, we don't have a department of synthesis or anything like that, but we do give people these positions. I'm thinking of, proper tenured professorial positions where they have an enormous amount of freedom in what they do with their time. And it's possible, for example, to be like me, a philosopher, and be thinking about complex systems earlier in my career and be thinking about science, how science works later in my career. But equally, you can be a scientist who really makes their name by doing a certain kind of science, but then later in life turns to the bigger questions. Well, still, maybe benevolently presiding over a lab, but no longer being involved in running it for 80 hours a week. That's so maybe the university system is actually pretty amenable, thanks to its, at least in its current version, where there's a lot of freedom, the other kind of academic freedom in how you actually spend your time. Maybe it's pretty amenable to the sort of synthesizing thinking we're talking about. So that is just, that doesn't by itself solve the problem, but it creates a structure within which the problem can be solved. Or you might think, and I think this is probably more your line of thought, we need a different kind of institutional structure to kind of, as it were, make the synthesis happen in a more active way, not just rely on individuals to do it because it's just so incredibly interesting for getting it done.
Well, and I think that there's such an unharnessed collective intelligence circulating that, I was thinking about when I was talking with Eric, it occurred to me a theory of consciousness is, if we were to come up with a theory of consciousness based on attention, YouTube, any of these social media platforms, you could extract almost people's identical attentional patterns. And so there's kind of a collective intelligence in that data itself. But then, what are we doing to get that to people, and to what extent do they need it? And I'm so surprised at how many people are so curious and want to learn things, but they don't want to do, like, I was like, should I go back and do another PhD? And my husband and I are both like, why would you do that? Why would you?
No,
Why would you? And of course, I would never. It's so silly. Like, I almost don't even. I wonder why I even did the first one. But like, it's because you want to be taken seriously, right? It's because, I think to myself, okay, if I wanted to study something, like, for example, the YouTube theory of consciousness or whatever, not only do I not have access to the data, but let's say I could find a data set that I could work with. It's not like it was in 1905 when Einstein submitted his thesis to the Journal of Physics, and they were like, sounds good. I like it. Check, check, check. You want a professorship? It's like, if I wanted to work in philosophy now, just as a person who has a podcast, or just like, I have several friends who are what I would call like neo-academics. They work in a warehouse, and then they spend their time writing amazing works. I think people don't realize that these people exist. I think the academics specifically don't realize that these people exist. What do we do with that overproduced elite?
Yeah, I think in a way that is the real problem, is not creating a situation where people will embark on these kinds of projects. It's creating, somehow sorting out ways that people with really interesting ideas can actually communicate them in ways that other people who could benefit will hear them.
Right.
So right now it's hard to know where to get started. There's so many people talking out there who all look like maybe they have something interesting to say.
Yeah.
Even within academia, it's really difficult these days to process the number of papers that are being written, even within a fairly narrow specialization. And that might be the real problem, is not producing the knowledge or the ideas, but getting them from where they're produced to where they might actually be usefully put to work.
So you think it's not that we're not capturing enough at the top of the funnel, it's that there's some bottleneck more so. Like, there may be even more ideas than can even fit in the funnel, but even within the funnel itself of like, interesting intellectual pursuits, where do we pick them out and what do we do with them?
Yeah. This isn't to say that lots of people, that it's probably the case that a lot of what's going on in the universities is boring and narrow and useless, but still there's enough interesting stuff going on that, and as you say, outside of the universities as well, there's no shortage of ideas. It's more the bottleneck in the funnel, the bottleneck in communication.
Okay. So I'm in the right place, I guess. Maybe I'm working in the right thing anyways. Cause part of me feels like I'm doing this podcast. What for? There's a million podcasts.
Yeah.
But I think in people like me putting these pieces out there and communicating with people like you, it amplifies a certain story and creates interest. And I don't know exactly where that goes or what happens with that, but I don't think that's my job to worry about it. So maybe what I'm gathering from this conversation is like, this is good enough.
Yeah. Well, I suppose in the end, somebody has to worry about where it's ultimately going.
Sure.
Or at least there would be a problem if nobody was listening to these podcasts.
Right.
But it might equally be a problem if people are listening to all of them and they don't
Right.
really know which to devote their intellectual energy to kind of really following up.
Well, I think that is a problem.
Hopefully we'll run out of time before you ask me to actually solve it, because I don't think I've nailed it.
No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to think if I have any more extremely difficult questions for you. I have to have at least one. Now that you said that, I'm
Mm,
totally gonna. I know the
okay.
one.
I'm ready.
It's relevant. It's relevant.
Mhm,
So you know how Kuhn says
mhm,
somewhere in the structure of scientific revolutions, he says that the people participating in the paradigm need to be working scientists pretty much exclusively, kind of maybe taking this like Dawkins like approach that, maybe excluding his own work from that paradigm. What do you think? Do you agree with this, or what is the role? Because I think there is a role. You called it the audience, I think at some point in your book. For the audience, the scientific audience, or the people who are paying attention to science or what's going on in the world. What's the difference between yours and Kuhn's perspective? And can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, certainly, I think Kuhn had a real insight there, seeing the importance of narrowness in science. What the expert does is they've kind of internalized the whole framework within which they're working, what Kuhn called the paradigm, famously. And it's really important to their ability to do science with a certain kind of intensity, with a certain kind of motivation, that almost all the options that are logically available to them are closed off because there's a kind of prescribed way of doing things. And they're just told, don't even think about these other possibilities. Just do it this one way. It's like this one long corridor, and you just need to run down it as fast as possible. So you may not explore a lot of territory, but you are going to break the speed record if that's your job. And it's kind of what's turned out to be really important to science, is having individual scientists just, often actually the metaphor is not, is more kind of depth,
Yes.
digging deep down into turning up what I call these little facts, these microscopic discrepancies that show us, and ultimately that we need a whole new theory of gravitation, that sort of thing. That seems right to me. I I don't think, however, that on the whole scientists are that constrained. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which they are constrained, but Kuhn, to some extent, and certainly, and this aspect of Kuhn really got amplified by people reading Kuhn, emphasized the sort of the intellectual or the conceptual closing off. At his most extreme, he said, you can't even conceive of anything other than your framework being the right framework. And which is a really cool idea, but I think it's not actually correct about working scientists. It would be truer to say that they don't really have to worry about these things, because their job is to get some data published in some journals, and they know that that's their job. And so they can maybe walk through all these other doors, but there's only one door with a big kind of, it's not so much a dollar sign, but a kind of a success sign, a fame sign. And that's the one they head towards. So in the same way, there's a kind of a narrow corridor. The motivational structure works not quite the way Kuhn thinks it works, by closing off intellectual possibilities, but more like creating just one way to be a really good scientist by doing this empirical testing. And that has the same result, same consequence of turning ordinary human beings, ordinary multifaceted human beings, at least when they're in the lab, wherever, into these monomaniacs who just care about one thing, this one experiment, which may or may not ultimately turn out to succeed, or even if it succeeds, to be very important at all. But that's their one way that they can make a difference, if they make any difference. And so that's what they do, and with all the kind of the fervor that gives science the drive and the power that it has.
Yeah. So do you think there's any role for like Feyerabend's participant versus observer? Like the participant is the scientist. What about all of us? We're observers. What is our
Well,
role?
yes, right. You did ask me about that. Well, our role is completely different and our motivational structure is completely different. In some sense where, occasionally I could actually compare scientists to elite athletes. So they kind of spend their whole lives, athletes or scientists, learning how to do this one thing incredibly well. And then we kind of enjoy the fruits of a kind of achievement, a kind of single-mindedness that creates that level of performance or that kind of tellingness of the data in science. We're mostly just kind of benefiting from their prowess. That most of the time it's just kind of, oh, great, there's this new gadget. But there's another role, of course, that we play as kind of citizens in some kind of political structure. We are anyway living in a democracy, and we have to actually make decisions. And then so we have to kind of we're not just sitting back, we have to think about the science a little bit and what it's telling us about. And of course, that takes us back into all the things we've been talking about so far today.
That's interesting. I mean, and I think that's a good way to conclude because, people who listen to this podcast are mostly not scientists. They're mostly bizarre creatives, like not bizarre in a bad way, in the best way possible, writers. And I often feel like, I wonder if they, their interest in science, their interest in these pursuits, I know they feel like intellectually alone and like they don't have a place to be with all of this. And so like, we're kind of all in the arena with these people, but I think we're missing some of that like camaraderie and the participation of it. So that's an interesting metaphor,
they're not, I guess, not a very hopeful one from the point of view of addressing this
right.
feeling of alienation from the process of doing science.
Right. But I see potential to kind of build on that and to think about it, because if you've ever been in the stands at an event, it's a lot of fun. I mean, there's a really interesting and fun collective perspective and shared joy and shared demise. And so in one hand, I saw it at first like, oh shit, we get nothing. We get to watch, But then I thought also like that participation in it is part of the whole experience, and there's got to be something in there. So I thank you for that metaphor. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you coming on this podcast. And I'm so excited to have you. So this is wonderful.
I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening, and here is the Big Nerve Challenge question for this episode. What could be some unexplored misconceptions about science that need to be rectified in order to enhance its value?